Thank you for being here. My name is Franco Pierno, acting chair of the Italian department. And today I'm very proud and glad to open a new Goggio lecture series. During this academic year, there will be around 14 lectures with international and outstanding guests. And you can find all the information on our social media and on our website. All the Goggio lectures will be in person, except two that will be online on Zoom and broadcast live on our YouTube channel. Actually, even this Goggio lecture, like the others in person, will be broadcast live on our YouTube channel. And so now we are live on the YouTube channel. I would like to thank you, Giovanna, for all this digital and technical work. Thank you, Giovanna. Today I'm also happy because this first Goggio lecture will be given by two friends of the department, of our department, Professoressa Paola Ugolini and Professor Marco Faini. Marco Faini, by the way, a few years ago was Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at U of T, University of Toronto. Well, now it's time to give the floor to my colleague, Professor Laura Ingallinella, who is Assistant Professor in Renaissance Studies and who will introduce our guests in a more accurate way. Thank you.
Adjusting the mic for our hybrid presence. I think I'll just keep it here. Is that okay for me to keep it like this? Thank you so much. So few figures in the literary world of Renaissance Italy are as difficult to put into a box as Pietro Aretino. Aretino lived in an era that was pervaded by a drive towards normativity, and yet all his works never acquiesced to this drive. Aretino always put his works in dialogue with systems of power, whether they were conventions of a literary genre or the power structures of the Renaissance court. And yet, despite this ever-changing exploration of many genres, from erotica to hagiography, from epistolary writing to tragedy, few figures have been also misunderstood as Pietro Aretino. These reasons and more make us particularly excited and grateful for the publication of a companion to Pietro Aretino, a new interdisciplinary collection of 19 essays plus introduction and preparatory materials, which has already become the point of reference to unravel Aretino's complexity. And we are particularly happy to welcome our two speakers, Professors Paola Ugolini and Marco Faini, to speak us about their volume today. Professor Paola Ugolini is Associate Professor of Italian in the Department of Languages and Literature at the University at Buffalo, where she also serves as an affiliate faculty in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Ugolini is the author of The Court and Its Critics, Anti-Courtly Sentiments in Early Modern Italy, published with our very own University of Toronto Press in 2020. To say that this book has been well received would be an understatement. The Court and Its Critics has reshaped the field of Renaissance court studies and our understanding of the different modes in which dissent would be expressed in Renaissance Italy. Other than Aretino, Professor Ugolini has also published articles on Ludovico Ariosto, Gaspara Stampa, and early modern satire. Our second speaker, Professor Marco Faini, is Assistant Professor of Italian in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature at the University at Buffalo, and he has held fellowships at the Herzog August Bibliothek, at the University of Cambridge, and at Villa Tatti in Florence. In 2018, Professor Faini published a biography of Pietro Bembo, L'alloro e la porpora, which is now available in translation into English and French. Other than a companion to Pietro Aretino, he has also co-edited Les Deux dans l'Europe moderne with Elise Boilet. Professor Faini's latest publication, Standing at the Crossroads, Stories of Doubt in Renaissance Italy, is forthcoming with Legenda, and we expect it with much trepidation. Together, Professor Ugolini and Professor Faini curated a companion to Pietro Aretino, which appeared in a well-established series with the publisher Brill, and it's a series curated by the Renaissance Society of America, providing gateways into important themes, author, and texts of the Renaissance. The complex labor of providing such a gateway, fare il punto, as we say in Italian, was much needed for a complex, fascinating figure like Aretino. We look forward to hearing more about the structure, challenges, and the result of this work. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Ugolini and Professor Faini, who will speak to us about Reassessing the Scourge of the Prince of Princes, a discussion on the companion to Pietro Aretino.
Tengo così. Thank you, Franco, for inviting us. Thank you, Professor Gallinella, for having us today. We're very happy to be here today. Very happy to be back in Toronto. We'll take turns today, so I will begin and then we'll move and change. So you may wonder why there was any need for a companion to Pietro Aretino, since usually companions are dedicated to the so-called major authors, or the one who constitute the canon of a literary tradition. Yet Pietro Aretino, an extraordinarily gifted author who epitomized several aspects of the Italian Renaissance, has never been considered fully part of the canon. The notion of the canon for any given artistic tradition or culture is indeed problematic in itself, leading not only to the exclusion from said canon of authors that we find relevant today, but also of authors who enjoyed remarkable popularity in their time. Besides, a long-lasting prejudice against any kind of literature falling under the broad umbrella of the comic has led scholars to dismiss many forms of expressions that did not adhere to the lofty standards of high style. As a consequence, experimental writers like Pietro Aretino himself, who in his production trespassed the boundaries of languages and genres, have been frowned upon and considered minori or sometimes anti-classicist or unorthodox. Aretino was not only disregarded in his importance as a writer and intellectual, he was also the protagonist of a black legend that started circulating already during his lifetime, as reconstructed in this volume by the essay by Harold Hendricks in the concluding article of this book. Aretino's several enemies, or former friends turned into enemies, spread rumors about his ignorance, his immorality, lack of faith, and his voracious sexual appetite, matched only by his greed for money. Aretino went down in history as an unbeliever, a blackmailer, a cunning and manipulative individual whose great talent resided mostly in his being able to take advantage of the print market and to curry favor with influential patrons. According to Anton Francesco Doni, a former friend of Aretino's, Aretino's tongue was a sharp knife with which he would cut the purse of those in power, and Aretino himself boasted about this, as we can see in this beautiful manuscript, autographed manuscript by Anton Francesco Doni. His flamboyant prose was considered precious but disengaged and deserved, flawed by his penchant for pornography. Indeed, such a negative reputation was based mostly on his poems, known as Sonetti Lussuriosi or Sonnets on the 16 Modes, which were based on a series of engravings by Marcantonio Raimondi. We'll get back to this. The other work that built Aretino's reputation as a pornographer are the dialogues known as the Sei Giornate, featuring the lives of prostitutes and extolling their lifestyle over that of married women and nuns. The immense success enjoyed by this work, already circulating in English translation in the last decades of the 16th century, overshadowed most of his other works, contributing to shaping Aretino as an inveterate pornographer. As a matter of fact, in the 1970s, the Sei Giornate loosely provided the inspiration for a number of Franci B-movies, including the 72 film L'Aretino nei suoi ragionamenti sulle cortigiane, le maritate e i cornuti contenti. However, in the last decades, scholarship, both in Italy and in the Anglophone world, has done a great work in rediscovering the real Aretino. The edizione nazionale of his works started in the early 1990s and still ongoing, also because of me, terribly late with the volume, but has finally provided reliable and accurate editions of his works. We now have a census of Aretino's autograph writings, and new works, both in manuscript and in print, have come to life. Archival discoveries have allowed to shed more light on his biography, although little is known about some episodes of his life. This new recognition of Aretino as one of the most influential and innovative characters of the Italian Renaissance culminated in late 2019 in a splendid exhibition at the Uffizi titled Pietro Aretino e l'arte del Rinascimento. And we chose this particular image because you see, again, the focus in the press was about scandal. So Aretino still is somehow related to scandal. Excuse me. In the previous year, a new biography of Aretino by Francesco Sberlati, significantly titled L'Infame, had come out, situating Aretino within the swirling geopolitical and cultural world of early 16th century Italian courts. The companion to Pietro Aretino is part of this new wave of interest in Aretino, his writings, and his contribution to European and Italian culture, offering an overview of his life and works and new approaches to his often innovative works.
Sorry, we have to switch the microphone, so please bear with us. But who was Pietro Aretino? One of the most prolific and, as we have just seen, controversial figures of 16th century Italy, Pietro Aretino was the first known author to have made a living through his writing. Called both divine and infamous, Aretino has successfully outwitted attempts to integrate his life and works into a coherent narrative. Born to a humble cobbler, Aretino climbed the social ladder in unprecedented ways. Before he died in 1556, Aretino could pride himself on being recognized as an interlocutor to Europe's political and cultural elites, and as the author of works ranging from verse and prose satires to chivalric romances, from pornographic dialogues to religious and hagiographic writings. In spite of the renewed interest in Aretino's works that Marco Faini has just explored, much remains to be done to overcome the scholarly prejudice that has for a long time relegated Aretino's writings to the field of marginal or often amoral, again, scandalo literature, and reduced his complex figure to stereotypes. A hint of Aretino's relevance for his contemporaries comes from Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, where Aretino is featured among the famous men and women of the time, and even given the designation of divine, divino. Resorting to a common trope, in the last cantos of its poem, Ariosto describes the conclusion of the poem as the end of a long journey and pictures himself as arriving on a boat to a safe haven, where he's welcomed by a gathering of illustrious men and women. I'm not going to read the entire quote from the Orlando Furioso, but you can see then in the the last verse that I'm quoting here. The part that I put in bold says, "Ecco il flagello dei principi," the scourge of princes, the title by which Aretino is usually known, il divin Pietro Aretino. So here the title of divino applied to Aretino. But for a long time, scholars have considered the attribution of this title, divino, to a writer of the likes of Aretino as ironic. How could a man whose list of works included not only pornographic sonnets, but also a dialogue among prostitutes, the title of which, Sei Giornate, that Marco Faini has just quoted, is significantly translated into English as the school of whoredom. So you see what kind of angle the translation wants to take. And a play titled La Cortigiana, which means the courtly play, but also refers to a term used to designate high-class prostitutes, the famous cortigiane of the 16th century. and who often inserted kitchen humor and explicit sexual elements in his writing, be granted the title of divine, but someone moreover respected as Ludovico Ariosto himself. And yet, when one considers the relevance that the figure of Pietro Aretino held in the Renaissance and the fundamental topics that his literary works addressed, one may start to revise the notion of Aretino as a marginal writer.
Okay, so in this, because of what Paola just said, in this companion, we wanted to move away from the notion of Aretino as the pornographer. And this is probably also the reason why among the 19 essays that make up this volume, there is only one essay devoted to the Sei Giornate. It's a beautiful and interesting article by Ian Frederick Moulton, a scholar of early modern pornography, titled 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her, Aretino's Ragionamenti, in which Moulton puts the Sei Giornate in dialogue with Jean-Luc Godard's eponymous movie, underlining how, and I quote, in both works, prostitution serves as a key to understand and critique shifting social relationships, personal, political, and economic, end of quote. This essay by Ian Frederick Moulton is part of the second section of this companion, which is dedicated to criticism and satire, includes an essay by Chiara Lastraioli on Pietro Aretino's Pasquinate, his political and satirical texts, and an essay by Paola Ugolini titled Aretino and the Court. This section explores the other staple of Aretino's reputation as a writer. So one is pornography, the other one is ferocious criticism of those in power that earn him the nickname of Scourge of Princes. And this essay follows a sort of introductory section called Selfhood and the Public Sphere, which includes essays by Raymond Waddington and Harald Hendricks. Aretino would have been one of the many satirical poets of his time had he been able to shape for himself a unique public persona. Waddington explores the invention of the celebrity authors, as he calls it, and the circulation of Aretino's image, showing how, unlike other writers, Aretino's reputation rested on his persona more than on his work. Exploiting the printing press, but also the highly developed Venetian arts and crafts, Aretino multiplied his presence and the presence of his image within Italian society, becoming, and I quote, a popular character with a much publicized life, which is very modern. Harald Hendricks, instead, studies Aretino's Venetian residences as a private and public space, often a hub for cutting-edge cultural production and a workshop in which private life became an instrument of self-fashioning. And again, this display of one's private life is something very new and very fascinating. So this section, the section that follows to this sort of introduction, centers, as already mentioned, on the roots of Aretino's literary career, his persona as a satirist, as the author of vehement poems known as Pasquinate, and as an insider to the less flattering aspects of court life. Shortly after he moved to Rome, around 1516, 1517, Aretino came to be identified with the popular figure of Pasquino, a Roman torso to which satirical poems were and are still appended on specific occasions. Once appropriated by Aretino, Pasquino began to expose the corruption and the vices of the Roman court and of its members, including popes and cardinals. Although nowadays most of Aretino's Pasquinate are lost, allegedly hundreds of them existed. What is left, however, testifies to Aretino's knowledge of the workings of Roman, Italian, and European politics, while mercilessly exposing their flaws, weaknesses, and corruption.
Later on, Aretino will devote an entire dialogue to the topic of the court. Aretino's relationship with the court is the focus of my essay, titled Aretino and the Court, on which I'd like to spend a few words now, and which explores the evolution of Aretino's thought on the early modern court as a system of power and the lives of courts and courtiers. The court appears as an almost haunting presence in Aretino's literary career. It's actually quite astonishing to notice how many among Aretino's works deal directly or indirectly with courts and courtiers, from the pasquinades and satires written during his early years in Rome, to the plays and the notorious dialogues among prostitutes, the unfinished chivalric poems and the letters, until the publication of his masterpiece of anti-court satire, which is aptly titled Ragionamento delle Corti, published significantly when Aretino had already established his residency in the Republic of Venice. What is even more striking is that at the peak of his fame and fortune, Aretino has been considered to replicate the model of a court, of which he was a sort of virtual prince in his own private residence in Venice. I will say more about this later, but from now on, I would like to say a little more about the importance of the court in Renaissance society. Because of the necessity for ruling families in the early modern period to establish their reputation not only through warfare, but also through manifestations of cultural and artistic refinedness, by basically showing off their prestige to rival courts in works of art and of literature produced with the intent of decorating and celebrating the court itself, early modern courts were in constant need of attracting talent. The system of patronage promoted by the courts made them a center of attraction for many writers, artists, and musicians in search of a way to pursue their vocation while making it also remunerative. For men born into the lower social strata, in particular, entering the court often represented the only opportunity for climbing the social ladder. The characteristics listed above rendered the early modern court a particularly fertile environment, a center where new ideas, fashions, and customs were elaborated and discussed before being disseminated, but at the same time, the abundance of ambitious and gifted individuals striving to attract the prince's attention in order to achieve commissions, posts, monetary rewards, and also fame, created an extremely competitive atmosphere. Every courtier, especially one who appeared to be set on a successful path, soon had to learn to guard himself from his peers and from the cutthroat rivalry that reigned at court. Princely favor, too, did not come without insecurities. Princes were known for being whimsical in their preferences and an easy prey of flatterers. As a result, the prestige and economic stability that one had painfully achieved could quickly be lost with no hope of ever recovering it. For someone like Aretino, as I said, a man born to a humble family in a medium-sized city, and yet endowed with enough talent and ambition to hope to make something out of himself beyond the plain life of a provincial artisan, becoming a courtier would have been the best option to achieve upward social mobility. The young Aretino moved to Rome in the second half of the 1510s precisely with this intention, and seems to have moved swiftly through the ranks of Roman society, becoming at first part of the household of the banker Agostino Chigi, and then being admitted into the circle of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici at the papal court. And yet, by the early 1520s, Aretino had seen enough of courtly life to feel sympathetic with the tradition of anti-court satire, and to start writing anti-court text of his own. The evils of the court, the whimsicality of princely favor, the flattery for those in power, the envy and the ruthless peer rivalry among courtiers that I've just described, were the object of a long satiric tradition that dated back to Greek and Roman satires and that was experiencing a comeback in the society of courts of the early modern world. In such writings, the court was often represented as a stormy sea where it is easy to shipwreck and as a place dominated by an uncontrollable, capricious fortune. Fortuna is the queen of the court. Aretino, who had been experimenting with satiric writing, found in anti-court satire a particularly congenial genre. Aretino's reflections on the dangers of life at court are first expressed at some length in a text composed in the early 1520s and meaningfully titled Lamento di uno cortegiano già favorito in palazzo e ora in grandissima calamità. You can see here in the 16th century original. The text has remained unknown until very recently when it was rediscovered and published in a modern edition by our very own Marco Faini, who attributed it to Aretino. What is the lamento? It is a speech given by the ruined courtier of the title, di corteggiano già favorito e ora in grandissima calamità. And it is basically an invective against the fake hopes and fame of success and that the court can raise, and a cautionary advice to every prospective courtier not to linger too much in any illusions of future success. The importance of the lamento resides in this being a testimony to the anxieties of someone who, like Aretino, was aware of being a self-made man, for whom favor at court could be the fastest way to move up the social ladder, but who at the same time could lose everything he had gained in the space of a moment. It is not surprising, hence, that the lamento starts precisely with a reflection on the power of fortuna at court. This is the incipit of the text. O sfacciate speranze della corte, favor briaco di volubil fume, o vil bugiarda e disonesta sorte, misera invidia al cortigian costume, principio, mezzo e fin con ogni male, come ho parlato, gettatemi in fiume. Despite its condemnation for the court, the lamento di uno cortegiano overall maintains an amused tone, a sense of playful participation in a carnivalesque atmosphere, such as the one that characterized the city of Rome during the papacy of Leo X. In the years that followed, Aretino's life and relationship with the court would undergo a complete transformation. Leo X died unexpectedly in 1521, and Aretino found himself in a particularly difficult situation. He left Rome for a period of peregrinations in northern and central Italy to return to the Roman court only after the election of a second Medici Pope, Clement VII, in 1523. But the second experience at the papal court of a Medici Pope was going to prove much less rewarding than Aretino may have expected. In 1526, Aretino summarized his experience with Clement VII in a very embittered sonnet that I'm going to read because it's actually a very good specimen of how funny Aretino can be, funny and inappropriate. 7 anni traditoro via gettati, con Leon 4 e 3 con Ser Clemente, please notice the pun, Clemente che mente, the one who lies. E son fatto nemico della gente, più per li loro che per i miei peccati. E non ho pur d'intrata 2 ducati e son da men che non ne già manente, onde nel culo, se ponete mente, ho tutte le speranze dei papati. Se le ferite vacasser ne avrei, per difendere l'onore dei miei patroni, moto proprio di ben 5 o 6. Ma benefici, uffici e pensioni hanno bastardi, furfanti e plebei, che i papi mangeriano in 2 bocconi. E i suoi servitor buoni muoion de fame, come che faccio io, cosa da rinnegar, domene Dio. You can see, the embitterment of the man who thinks that he's the loyal one, he's faithful to his patron, and yet he's not the one who's being rewarded because people who are, duplicitous and able to flatter them are. Aretino's reflection on the court would reach the full maturity in his 1538 dialogue, Ragionamento delle Corti. The text that I've already quoted stages the conversation over 2 days between a man named Francesco Goggio, who is thinking of abandoning his studies to become a courtier, and a group of friends, the poligrafo Lodovico Dolce, the courtier Pietro Piccardo, and the man of letters Giovanni Giustiniano, who eventually succeed in opening his eyes and dissuading him from becoming a courtier. The importance of Aretino's Ragionamento delle Corti resides not only in its outspoken depiction of the dynamics of life in 16th century courts, but also in the figure of the intellectual that it presents as an advisable model. Someone who, like Aretino himself, has abandoned the world of the princely courts and moved to the Republic of Venice, but someone who is also able to maintain useful connections with the courts as centers of power. An intellectual who is free from courtly servitude, but who can still resort to princes for patronage and support. This model is proposed at the time when Aretino has successfully established his residency in Venice, as I already said, in the rooms of Palazzo Bolani first, and later in Palazzo Dandalo, both facing the Canal Grande. So quite an impressive point of arrival for the son of a cobbler. In his place of residence, Aretino would live lavishly and generously, as if he were a prince himself. In Paul Larivai's definition, Aretino would eventually become a sort of prince without land, un principe senza terra. And one could also say that he became the mirror opposite of a prince as exemplified by his liberality towards his friend and his openly stated habit of recklessly spending that opposed the avarice that he had disapproved so much in the courts and in the rulers. It is important to point out that after having explored the courts of the earth, the papal one and the princely ones, the Ragionamento delle Corti ends on a quite unexpected religious turn. with a praise of the court of heaven, here invoked as the only perfect court. In conclusion, Aretino shows that a perfect court cannot be a thing of this world. But this conclusion also adds a nostalgic nuance to what is otherwise a caustic, often irreverent text, and easily calls to mind the equally visionary conclusion of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, right? The unexpected mystical turn of the satiric anti-court dialogue needs also to be linked to Aretino's contemporary attempts to establish a reputation for himself as a religious writer, following the publication in the mid-1530s of his first sacred works that Marco Faini will now explore in depth.
Yes. So this brings us to the probably the most, how can I say, I don't want to say most innovative, but probably, yeah, innovative is the right word, aspects of this companion. We wanted to shed more light on Aretino's religious works. We wanted to study these works that have received little attention in the past, and we wanted to finally present Aretino as fully part of the religious discussions of his time. We thought that time had come to reassess Aretino also as a religious writer. In recent years, the studies by Paolo Marini and Elise Bollet have partially filled the gap, this gap in scholarship. We have now new editions of Aretino's religious works. Christopher Cairns in the mid-1980s, more recently, Augusta Gentili and Raymond Waddington have explored Aretino's religiosity, which has been often dismissed as of little significance, and this probably is still the common perception. Many scholars still seem to grapple with the idea that Aretino could partake in the heated religious discussion of the Cinquecento, and yet he penned 7 long and complex religious works between 1534 and 1543. These are biblical prophecies or rewritings and 3 hagiographies that have captured scholarly attention, mostly because of the visual appeal of Aretino's prose, as if he were competing with the powerful and beautiful paintings by his friends Titian and Tintoretto. In fact, many references to some of the most debated topics of early 16th century spirituality, from salvation by grace to the destiny of the soul in the afterlife, can be found in many of Aretino's works, including in some of his plays, as I tried myself to show in some of my articles on Aretino. Christopher Cairns, the author of a pioneering study of Aretino's religious prose, has divided these works according to 3 main partitions, following a trajectory that begins with Aretino's adherence to evangelical ideas in the early 1530s to arrive to a more orthodox approach in the early 1540s, a time when Aretino was hoping to be appointed cardinal. Aretino had the dream to become a cardinal, just like Pietro Bembo. The effort that Aretino put over the course of a decade in writing sacred narratives was the reason why we dedicated a whole section of this companion to religion. In this section, as religious works, their relationships with contemporary visual arts, especially with Tintoretto's paintings, and their afterlife in the post-Tridentine era, when they became the object of imitation on the part of men and women penning religious prose. Such imitation of Aretino's religious texts, ironically, took place despite his works being on the index of prohibited books since 1559. The condemnation of Aretino's production happened also through the workings of his enemies. Again, Aretino had a lot of enemies, including Girolamo Muzio, who was the one behind Aretino being put on the index. In this companion, Paolo Procaccioli, as you probably know, one of the leading scholars of Aretino, has studied Aretino's enemies in his beautiful essay titled Aretino as a Target for Criticism and His Enemies from Berni to Muzio, investigating the occasions of the attacks, also physical attacks. Aretino was physically assaulted more than once. He lost his fingers at some point. The occasions of the attacks on Aretino by his enemies and the consequences of such attacks on the fortune of Aretino's works. against the background of the self-praise and the self-absolution that characterize Aretino's letter writing. Aretino's networks are indeed one of the challenges of studying such a multifaceted figure. Aretino is very difficult to capture, not only because he's a unique writer, but also because he really has these large networks of correspondents, friends, enemies, patrons. So studying Aretino means also studying all these figures that surround him. And we decided to have a section in this companion called Networks, in which we included essays by Paola Procaccioli, by Paola Rivile, who studied Aretino's vernacular letters as an instrument in shaping his public persona, in an essay called Aretino as a Writer of Letters. And also in this section, we have an essay by Brian Richardson, in which Brian studies the dissemination of Aretino's work through a combination of orality, manuscript, and print as a way to gain notoriety, seek patronage, and enhance his status, as pointed out by Brian himself in a very nice and very rich essay called Pietro Aretino and Publication. Aretino, in fact, was known for planning very carefully the publication of his works and was very skilled at identifying the most cutting-edge trends of the print market. Aretino's religious works, published, like I said, over the course of 10 years, are part of this strategy. And still, one may be puzzled, I certainly am, when considering that his so-called pornographic works, the Sei Giornate, which is divided into the Ragionamento and the Dialogo, came out respectively in 1534 and in 1536, while the sonetti lussuriosi, sonetti sopra I 16 modi, despite being composed in the mid-1520s, were printed in 1537, as recently suggested and demonstrated by Danilo Romei. This means that the celebrated pornographer Aretino composed, in addition to some obscene poems, mostly written in his early years, only 3 major works that we can label as pornographic. These works were printed over 3 years, which is a tiny fraction of Aretino's long-lasting career, and yet Aretino came to be identified almost exclusively as the lascivious and scandalous writer of lewd works. Certainly, their literary quality stands out, and their novelty and boldness have no equal in mid-16th century Italian literature. Nonetheless, one wonders whether some reassessment or even a reversal of Aretino's profile is needed. And I would suggest that we should not see Aretino as a pornographer who happens to write a bunch of religious narratives just to please his patrons. Rather, we should look at Aretino as a person deeply involved in the religious discussions of his time, who also authored pornographic works. The fact that he published the latter at the same time when he was composing and printing his religious works may appear paradoxical and a sign of Aretino's opportunism. Yet, consider the above-mentioned careful exploitation of the print market, things may change on closer inspection. I will leave aside the sonetti lussuriosi. The sonetti, as is well known, are ekphrastic description of engravings by Marcantonio Raimondi after lost drawings by Giulio Romano. As such, they find their place in the Roman classicism of the 1510s, 1520s, within the circle of Raffaello, where the exploration of the human body, as well as bold sexual references, were by no means uncommon. One should only think of Giovanni da Udine's frescoes in the Farnesina. If we turn to the Ragionamento and the Dialogo, however, things change. The Dialogo is less pornographic than religious, for references to devotional practices, including charms and spells, as well as other practices of domestic religion, abound. In a time when Aretino was closer to the evangelical spirituality, and I'm quite persuaded that he was, this can be hardly underestimated. However, there may be deeper reasons for Aretino's interest in sexuality at the exact time when his theological interests became deeper and more complex. One should investigate, for example, the importance of the conflation of sexuality and theology, which is a crucial topic investigated, among others, by Leo Steinberg, Marilyn Aronberg, Lavin, and Alessandro Nova. Now, this requires a change of perspective that many scholars seem unwilling to make. As a result, now as in the past, Aretino remains primarily a somewhat embarrassing author, one that undergraduate students should not approach. Historically, this is also the result of the many apocryphal pornographic works attributed to Aretino over 2 or 3 centuries, as documented by Giuseppe Crimi in his incredibly rich essay for this companion. As in the case of the Pasquinate, in other words, Aretino became a label for a series of works printed in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, exploring the world of sexuality in all its morbid details. As we hope to have shown, Aretino, and we can now come to our conclusion, as we hope to have shown, Aretino is one of the most innovative 16th century intellectuals and one of the most versatile writers of his time. He tried his hand at several genres, although he often failed, as in the case of the chivalric poems he never managed to accomplish, as documented by Cristina Cabani in her essay A Knot of Barely Sketched Figures. He was also a playwright, an author of comedies, but also of a tragedy titled L'Orazia, and here in Toronto, Michael Lettieri studied and published the text. In his plays, Aretino explored the contradictions of contemporary society, as Diana Shemek and Jane Tylus show in their contribution. Besides, he was also a poet, the author of hundreds of sonnets, not only satirical sonnets, but also religious and encomiastic sonnets, at least as he claimed, of which he kept no memory whatsoever, despite disseminating them in his books of letters and in some of the most important 16th century anthologies of poetry. As a matter of fact, his first known work is a collection of poems in the style of courtly 15th century poetry, published in Venice in 1512. But on the frontispiece of that work, Aretino presented himself as a painter. Although little is known of his apprenticeship as a painter in Perugia before he moved to Rome, in his later years he enjoyed a wide reputation as a connoisseur of art, a skill grown out of his personal friendship with artists such as Giulio Romano, Sebastiano del Piombo, Titian, Tintoretto, Jacopo Sansovino, and the many Venetian painters from Schiavone to Lorenzo Lotto, with whom he corresponded and had a friendly relationship, as studied by Philip Cottrell's, in Philip Cottrell's essay in this companion, Aretino and the Painters of Venice. However, Aretino was not only a refined collector and expert of objects of art, not just paintings, but also the so-called minor arts, from jewelry to glass art, but had a strong interest in music. And this is also probably a little novelty of this companion. We have an essay on Aretino music by Kathy-Ann Elias, who shows in how Aretino's works offer fascinating reconstructions of Venice's soundscape, while also containing references to musical performances and traditional songs. No.
Last switch. So, in virtue of the multiplicity of his interests, we believe that Aretino, probably more than any other Italian Renaissance writer, should be analyzed against the complex and evolving background of his time. All the essays in this volume explore the rapidly changing cultural, religious, literary, and artistic panorama of the 16th century. We, as Marcos said, wanted Aretino to emerge as an agent of cultural change more than simply a however talented writer, and specifically more than simply, a scandalous writer. The result, we hope, is a work that, while providing an all-around picture of Aretino, both as a writer and as an intellectual, also offers a comprehensive image of Italian culture in the first half of the 16th century. The collection of essays reveals Pietro Aretino not only as a transgressive figure who broke the rules, but also as the heir to canonical literary tradition, and eventually as the maker of new rules. The essays gathered in the companion reveal a figure, and a fundamental one, in the development of European literature and culture, and carefully reconstruct his literary circle and his European networks. The multidisciplinary approach that we strived to implement allowed us to bring to life Aretino's portrait in the round, an innovative experimental writer who prided himself on his acquaintance with emperors, pontiffs, kings, and princes. A fine connoisseur and a man deeply involved in the tumultuous political changes of his time, Aretino has left behind a tremendous legacy, opening new paths to European cultural production and shaping a new image of the author. We hope that our volume will pave the way for new interpretations of this fundamental figure for Italian and European culture. And this is what we leave you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers for a fantastic presentation. Before I unleash myself, I would invite all the attendants in person and online. If you have any questions, any curiosities, here are the experts on on Aretino. So we have a wonderful opportunity to tap onto that expertise. Yes. Yes, so I think for the sake of our online attendance, we will, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. You can, oh, sure. Oh,
That's fine. Well, thank you so much. First of all, I'm really happy to see you here again. So thank you for coming. Thank you for presenting this amazing work. I would like to start from like a small comment, starting from what you, Marco, were saying at the very beginning when you said this unconventional the fact of dedicating a companion to an author who is not a canonical one. But at the same time, my feeling is that, I mean, if we agree on the fact that a companion or the scope, the aim of a companion is to provide a new, comprehensive, accessible, and possibly interdisciplinary appraisal of an author, well, there is no author who would deserve such endeavor more than Aretino, because, as you explained, he really suffered from biased reception. And by the way, just for our students, this work is also completely accessible on U of T libraries. So please do not hesitate to consult it and to use it in your work. Of the several, let's say, approaches and doors that you opened by presenting it, there is one, which is the one in which I'm perhaps the most interested. And this is the one that you tackled multiple times by reflecting upon the connection between Aretino's quest for becoming a writer or an intellectual or an acknowledged figure is difficult to define or to case him in one case, and the work he performed to shape his persona, or to put it with Greenblatt, in his self-fashioning. And I think that your work illustrates, and this is something confirmed also by other cases, and of course I'm thinking about the case of Dante because it's the one I know the better, how this work is always linked with other aspects of the activity. For instance, and you mentioned the exposure of one's private life or self-telling, the construction of crazy networks to somehow survive and to affirm oneself, the publication plan, which is extremely well curated in Aretino's case, and all that we could name in our like contemporary lexicon, the dissemination activities, right, that an author like this one has to do. And of course, the eclectism, the pluristylism, and so on. To me, another important aspect, and this is the question, is the effort put to shape one's own readership within their works. So my question for you is, would Aretino's case confirm the importance of this feature in this particular series of eclectic authors or not?
I'm not sure I got the question, because thank you, first of all, for your comment. It's wonderful, and thank you for your nice words. And I think Aretino at the same time that he's shaping his own persona as a writer, he's finding his place, he's also creating his own reading public, I guess. I don't know if that's the question, but he has to carve a space for himself, and at the same time he has to create a readership. Absolutely. He chooses to write in the vernacular in the first place, probably because he wouldn't have been able to write in Latin, but still, he refuses the Petrarch and imitation of Petrarch, more the imitation than Petrarch himself. And he does so in a time when actually Petrarchism is the thing. So that's a bold move, right? If you want to create a space for yourself, it's probably easier to follow in the footsteps of those that are already enjoying success. Aretino is able to find a place for himself. He makes a series of moves when he's in Rome. He chooses to identify himself. We have talked a lot about creating a persona, so shaping something. But what Aretino does before that is that he loses his own voice, he loses his own face, his own persona. He merges with Pasquino, which is, again, is a very bold move. He kind of erases his voice. In a strange dynamic, he kind of multiplies his voice as Pasquino, but also he creates that kind of gray area where everyone is Pasquino, everyone is Aretino, Aretino is everyone else. So that's all these steps create a sort of leadership. Aretino becomes this mythical figure. And from that moment on, he moves on by making a sort of extraordinarily innovative moves, like, for example, his books of letters. He's the first to come up with a series of books of letters, publishing his own correspondence in the vernacular, exposing himself, his private life, his circles of correspondence. And in this, is creating his own market, and he's very jealous of his readership. For example, when Bernardo Tasso publishes his books of letters, Aretino gets it. They said, "That's my territory. That's what I do." So I don't know if I answered to your question, but
Okay. Yeah, I can say something more. I mean, I think Marco has covered the question of Aretino and his readership in full, but I really thank you for bringing the attention to the notion of self-fashioning in relation to Aretino, because I think, he was a master of self-fashioning, as illustrated by Raymond Waddington's book on Aretino and the medals. And, probably I should be here. Yeah, I was saying, Aretino, as illustrated also by Raymond Waddington's books on Aretino and the creation of medals, how he played with the figure of the satyr to fashion his own persona. It's really one of the authors that can support the statement, although, Greenblatt's notion of self-fashioning has been rediscussed in many ways, and I kind of personally agree with John J. Martin's more nuanced reading of the issue of self-fashioning, but it's one of the authors that support the statement that there was such a thing as Renaissance self-fashioning, as John Jeffries Martins points out. It was people had more agency than what Greenblatt originally, envisioned. That's me. Again, the notion of Aretino's readership and legacy, I think that what Aretino did with the figure of the other, so I'm not a Dante scholar, I'm not going to touch Dante because I'm scared of Dantisti, but because you know too much. But what Aretino did with the figure of the other is also fascinating, and something that really puzzles me is how Aretino's legacy as an author was disseminated. And I think, and this is just me, that one of the biggest influence that the figure of the author shaped by Aretino had was on Venetian women writers. I think that there is a legacy that goes from Aretino to Gaspara Stampa to Veronica Franco in terms of people who were marginalized, whose voice had been wasn't recognized, who needed their voice to be heard, and who were in a precarious position in terms of what they could do socially, in terms of their the social respect that they could have, and who found in the boldness of Aretino a model that they could use. This is just me. People have told me that I'm crazy. Okay. Because, the notion that that a woman could think of Aretino as a model sounds weird. But if you think of the way in which Aretino is sympathetic, if I have one regret for this companion is not to have included an essay on Aretino and gender. If you think of the way in which Aretino is sympathetic to his prostitute figures, like Nanna, he is Nanna, Nanna is Aretino, right? What other Renaissance writers does that? Maybe Ariosto, possibly Ariosto, right? But you don't have someone who invests a female figure and a controversial female figure, a figure who could be easily blamed and marginalized and silenced, with the figure of the author, like Aretino. I think in the 16th century you don't find it. And I think that this resonated with female readership in a way that we may have, underestimated so far. Again, that's me.
Going in your direction, I'm simply to exchange ideas about that, something that can be interesting, thinking about the earlier tradition. Sorry.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Something that could be interesting to and that would support what you were saying, thinking about the earlier tradition, is the way in which women actually works as fictionalized readers within the text of some authors, exactly to open up the door to the creation of a new readership. And what happens is that actually historical women identify themselves with the fictionalized figures within the text, and so reacted and somehow endorsed the discourse that was fictionally addressed to them. So I'm thinking about the Decameron, I'm thinking about the Snow, I'm thinking about a certain Dante. I would say that the earlier tradition provides some, strong endorsement to your ideas. So I would like to, I hope that you will work on this later on, and I will read you.
I will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brilli. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please. You can ask from here, and then I can rephrase the question for the virtual audience, if you prefer that.
From an amateur perspective, just curious about the influence, if any, by Castiglione on Aretino, because they seem to cover some of the same ground, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
So the question is to elaborate the influence from the connection between Castiglione and Aretino.
If any.
Yeah, okay, you're basically inviting me to a wedding, as we say in Italian, invitare a nozze, when you make someone happy because they have a lot to say. Okay, so I will just mention the most famous example, which is how the play La Cortigiana is considered a reversal of Il Cortigiano, the Book of the Courtier. So it has been considered a parody, a rewriting, the exact opposite. So some people have said that Aretino is in a way the anti-Castiglione, which we can agree, but we can also not agree on, because Aretino himself is trying to fashion a persona. It's just like Castiglione was building with words the perfect courtier, Aretino is in a way building himself, going back to the issue of self-fashioning that I was discussing with Professor Brilli. Aretino is building himself as a figure of author that could be put there as a model. But mostly, the biggest point of comparison has been this play, La Cortigiana, where there is actually a very fun pun, because there is a character, this guy from provincial Siena, Macco d'Acqua is his name, who goes to the court of Rome to become cortigiano nelle forme, courtesan in forms, which is literally a pun on formare, forming the perfect courtier, formare con parole il perfetto cortigiano of the Book of the Courtier. And then you have, of course, this guy is beaten up because this is how you shape a perfect courtier. They take the metaphor literally, so they put it, and they say they don't want to put him into this kind of press that is going to, mold him into a perfect courtier, etc. And then, of course, il cortigiano, but la cortigiana is the prostitute. And so basically the relationship is that, has been understood as that of parodic reversal, but I believe that there could be much more to say about that, also in terms of a non-ironic, non-parodic influence. Vuoi dire qualcosa?
For me, on a slightly different note, but following up on the same topic. I guess your question makes a really important point, that of Aretino's influence on other writers, for example, on Ariosto. Many would have said in the past that Ariosto has certainly a certain influence on Aretino, but it's also true the other way around. Aretino had a strong influence on Ariosto, although it may sound strange that Ariosto was somehow reading and Aretino, and he was using Aretino as an example. But yeah, that's what makes Aretino really interesting. We would say that because he was an outsider, major writers, that what we were saying at the beginning, would kind of disregard Aretino. In fact, he was very highly regarded in his time, and probably he was an inspiration for many writers, in some respects at least. And this was clear probably back then in the 16th century, and we sort of, because of those bias that we mentioned, we sort of lost the right perspective. Aretino could have been a very influential writer, and his dialogue anyway, even if we don't want to talk about reciprocal influence, at least his dialogues with other writers was certainly more complex than we tend to think of today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay, I have one that actually builds on to the two that have been asked so far, and it's about genealogies, because sometimes with authors like Aretino, it's easy to praise them and see them for what they go against, the kind of models that they refute, the changes that they make. And so my question to you would be, we talked about the complexity of the influence over or by Ariosto, but what are the genealogies that you can and you have recognized in Aretino's work? What are the fathers and sort of like, literary models that he accepts and incorporates into his work?
That's a great question. The models. There are many. Aretino's game is that of presenting himself as a very naive writer with sort of genius, whose prodigious minds creates works out of nowhere. That's the story that he writes and he repeats over and over again. That's the story that his friends and acquaintances say over and over again, that he could write 1 hour in the morning, a couple of days a week, and then he would write just perfect, amazing works. So he had no genealogy whatsoever. In fact, he didn't. Aretino was a very refined reader. He knew Petrarch, for example. The legend that he disregarded Petrarch is not true. Actually, he knew Bembo, he knew Petrarch, and there's a lot of imitation there. He had people working for him. That's another interesting point. Even if Aretino didn't have access directly to certain sources, for example, in Latin, but had people working with him, for him. For example, he knew Erasmus, who had published his letters in Latin. But he had people who could translate those letters for him, and that's probably where he came up with the idea of publishing his own letters. So there's a lot of influence there. And another point that is really important to make is that probably Aretino looked for inspiration also outside the literary fields. For example, he would look at his artist friends and take some inspiration from them. There's, especially in the Venetian period, there's a lot of exchange of ideas concerning the idea of prestezza, writing quickly between Aretino and his new painters that I mentioned, Schiavone, especially young Tintoretto, so about going against the canon of Titian and earlier painters. So there's a lot of reciprocal influences. So Aretino has his models, and is less naive than he wants us to believe.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? We have 5 minutes left, so if there is any Aretino-related curiosity in your minds before, again, I unleash myself and I continue asking questions. I will just go ahead then. That's all. More space for me. You know, as someone who comes to Renaissance literature as originally a reader and scholar of hagiography writing, I'm deeply fascinated by the work that you've been doing, you know, sort of like putting forth the idea of Aretino as a religious writer. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the connection between, on the possible connection, if there is one, between pornography and hagiography. Because there have been, especially for early medieval texts, a strong body of scholarship, you know, highlighting the fact that, you know, we write and we think about martyrs and saints, specifically female saints, as a sort of like, you know, sort of like a voyeuristic sense, right? And so I'm wondering, you know, I'm wondering if you could elaborate more about how Aretino approaches this, you know, centuries-long tradition and what he does with all of that.
I was hoping no one would ask. It's such a huge question, this one. Okay, I think that, again, we have a bias. We look at the depiction of sexuality with different eyes than those of people living in the Renaissance or even earlier. So, on the one hand, okay, probably we should make a little distinction between the earlier religious works by Aretino and the three hagiographies that are written at a later stage. I think on the one hand, it's certainly, Aretino has a beautiful letter. He says, I must write a whole book out of a legend or out of a story that basically fills one page. So I guess that's the life of the Virgin, probably. But anyway, so he has to come up with ideas. One of the tricks that he comes up with is that, of course, of resorting to his traditional tools of describing, for example, women's beauty. That probably still continues in the 18th century, 17th century with kind of Baroque sacred poems, prose, in which, for example, on the Magdalene, in which all the sensuous aspects are retrieved in a way that, you know, so you're actually writing about a saint, but then you're using all these, you know, sexual undertones and sexual descriptions and sexual things. Then there is the theological problem, that of the sexuality of Christ, for example, that has been studied by Leo Steinberg, and by the beautiful, in that beautiful essay by Aaron Berglavin on it's called the Art of the Misbegotten, that moves from the Middle Ages onwards. And that's a very complicated topic. I really wish I knew more. It's something I want to investigate in the. So I guess we have different levels. So on the one hand, Aretino is able to retrieve certain parts of his inspiration, sort of, and turn his interest in the depiction of sexuality, of the body, and to turn them into something more acceptable, which is probably not unique to Aretino. There's a tradition there, as you said. But then also there is a deeper theological problem. And I don't know if and to what extent Aretino was conscious of that. I guess probably that was part of the discussion surrounding. So I'd say that there is definitely a lot of work to be done in this direction.
Thank you, and I'm glad that we ended up on like future perspectives. I think our time is up, so thank you to all of the attendants in person and online. And I think we will see one another at the next Goggio lecture. Thank you so much.